Welcome back to the Sales Pulse podcast. I'm Marla Koupal, the Sales Conversation Architect. I help new and experienced sales professionals and small business teams tune up their sales conversations and enhance sales outcomes. We can always use a tune up because we do acquire some bad habits. Today, these are 3 sales tips that you might want to take a look at. Sales teams rarely fail because they don't understand their product. They fail because the sales conversations slowly drift away from the buyer. If the seller is more seller focused than they are buyer focused, the opportunity diminishes to make the sale. This happens very, very quietly. Many times the buyer is interrupted while they are trying to explain. People don't appreciate that. Sometimes solutions are presented before you really fully understand the buyer. Conversations drift when the seller begins to answer before the buyer finishes their question. Assumptions kill sales. Then sometimes the solution is offered before the buyer really feels fully understood. They want to tell you the full story. Be ready for it. And then explanations start replacing the seller's curiosity about the buyer. Your information is worthless if you don't know that buyer. Awareness of the buyer is key to success. So buyers start feeling crowded when you start protecting, give them all the thoughts you want to give them. Well, when this happens, their responses become shorter and their attention to you is just limited because they're getting frustrated. They become more cautious. Sometimes the buyer just simply disappears as soon as they can. They're just not going to open up to you again. Have you seen that? Have you felt that? Yes, I believe you really do know what I'm talking about. So let's look at 3 quick resets that small business teams can use immediately. These are not scripts, they're tune-ups. When these adjustments happen, buyers participate more easily, create the conversation. My first tip is just slow down on your first question. Let's not put the buyer on the spot like so many of you do. When a seller greets someone and says, "Can I help you?" the seller believes that question's polite, yet the buyer experiences something else. The buyer is suddenly responsible for defining their entire situation and letting you in on all their thoughts. And you know what? They just don't want to do that. Most buyers aren't ready to share those details. And they haven't fine-tuned them yet, so they may not have much to share. And the buyers will sometimes protect their space with the fastest exit available, like a phone call. They turn it over to their spouse, or they say, "Just looking." You don't want that because it gives you no mileage into your conversation. There are better openings. They invite the buyer in to explain their thoughts. What is top of their mind instead of forcing them to define their position? They don't need you until you understand them. You might ask them questions like, "What caught your attention? What are you exploring right now? What got you looking at this today?" Notice what changes with the buyer when you ask those simple, open-ended questions. They begin explaining what is on their mind, or maybe even what they've been thinking about, and maybe what they've tried, and maybe why they haven't acted on this desire until today. When the buyer explains their thinking, the seller will always learn something useful. They'll learn about the buyer. Do they have urgency? Do they have confusion? Do they have a dream? What are their emotional needs, or what's the emotional flavor around what they're sharing with you? And is there a practical tone to this and the buyer's self-regret for not having acted sooner? All of those factor into the conversation. Now, there's nothing for you to solve at this point, but there is great data in their sharing that is going to get you further in that conversation. When you learn about what the buyer cares about in that moment, That small shift will create the theme of the conversation that you will have with the buyer and build that relationship with your product. This is the collaborative part of the conversation. This is the way you connect with your buyer. When that happens, the buyer is going to stay engaged with you for a much longer time. Secondly, you want to let the buyer finish their thoughts, their thinking. So the second seller habit that disrupts sales conversations is something that many of you do without noticing. All of a sudden, in the middle of a conversation, the buyer goes quiet and you immediately start talking again. Stop. You're adding more features. You're adding more explanations. They're thinking. You are keeping the conversation moving by letting them think. They want to think of their next question. They want to maybe start thinking about how they could use something. Maybe you didn't answer their last question. You ignored it or jumped over it with something you thought was important. Or maybe they're just visualizing, will I really use this when I get it? When buyers are thinking about their choices, you need to let them think about their options and what they might want to do or ask you before they act. When you're fearful of silence, you lose. Let's reframe how you see silence inside a sales conversation. They're measuring. Will they implement now? Are they ready to spend that money? What's their trust factor for what you've shared with them already? What's the energy behind them making this choice? All of those are filters that you're looking for out of what they say and by how they're behaving. So silence is not a dreaded moment in a conversation. It's a welcome moment because you can see that the buyer is trying to get involved with you, but they have to get their thoughts together first. If they go silent, all you have to do at some point is say, so what part of what we're talking about do you feel relates to you or stands out to you? Or what are you considering right now? So that they have the moment, you know that you're with them, and then you just wait. I know waiting's hard when you've all been shown how to just keep things rolling, but keeping things rolling is not how you make a sale. I'm one of those buyers that has to hear my thoughts out loud. It's like I'm talking to myself so that I can hear what it is I'm really thinking and put it in some form of organization. So by asking those open-ended questions, what are you thinking about now? Or how does this seem to relate to you? Then the buyer can share with you what they're thinking, how their decisions are forming, and there's a new layer of energy added to the conversation. Tip 3, resist solving the buyer's problem too early. Oh my gosh, how many of you do that? You pride yourself on being a quick problem solver. But if you're bringing that energy to a sales conversation, that can create a different problem. You might mention the solution and the buyer will immediately resist. Because you don't know the buyer, you haven't heard them, they're not going to give you a laydown. You're going to have to wait and see if your solution is really a fit before you blurt it out. You don't want to go into advice right away. You don't want to go into features that they might like to handle that. You need to qualify that problem that they feel they have and work it through. The buyer never is giving you the full story. You know that in their first statement. So always ask them for more. Let your fixer sit on the bench. The fixer is not needed at any point in any sales conversation. The buyer wants to be sure you hear all of their story. They want you to understand what they're saying. You're going to have some good responses and acknowledge them throughout. If your recommendation is too quick, it's not going to work. You want the emotional flavor that their decision-making will need. Don't go too far, too fast. You might say things like, what have you tried so far? Where does this become frustrating for you? What would a good outcome look like? Those questions will deepen the buyer's explanations to you. And now you know how your product or service might fit for them. Buyers are never generic. And when you stop coming in with solutions first, they'll always reveal to you their levels of urgency, the extra criteria that maybe even you hadn't thought of, and how they're going to make their considerations. Some buyers are simply curious, and some are searching for relief. You can only discover which one it is. Once the buyer situation is clear, your solutions can make sense. The buyer's decision becomes easier. So let's bring it all together for today. Most small business teams believe improvement comes from better scripts or stronger pitches. In reality, the biggest improvements usually come from small changes in conversation and behavior. Bring in sales coaches with easy mind-changing exercises and practice that will tune up any small business team. This is what I do, and it really is a small step that creates big results. First, just slow down those first few questions that you ask. 2, allow the buyer to finish their thoughts. Even if they're silent in front of you, let them think it through. And ask one more question before you offer the solution. When you adjust those 3 things, your sales conversations become more vital, more successful, more consistent, and beneficial to you because you'll get more yeses. This week, as you're in sales, here's what I want you to do. I want you to notice how you're opening conversations. And when are you jumping in too soon? I want you to notice when the buyer comes quiet and see what kind of adjustments you're making to your behavior to make things better. When you do this, you'll be able to modify your sales behaviors and find yourself getting more agreement in your conversations. Subscribe to the Sales Pulse podcast. Leave your questions or your comments so that I can respond and help you out. I'm Marla Koupal, the Sales Conversation Architect for small business, sales teams, and individuals. You can find the Sales Pulse podcast on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. Subscribe soon.